I'm only standing here because the war on drugs is not about drugs. Right? Going back to that issue of policing. I'm only here because the war on drugs isn't really about the thing it pretends to be about. What do I mean by that? I think you know what I mean by that. And I can tell you what I'm about to tell you because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit and they can't touch me now. I'm being quite serious. Keep in mind now, the reason I know the war on drugs isn't about drugs, two things. One is all the data tells me. Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes on Drug Abuse, every study you choose to consult says what white folks are just as likely, if not more likely, to use drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, to possess drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, to sell drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, than people of color to become addicted to them, right? So the rates of usage, possession, dealing, and addiction equal or greater, depending on the age group for whites, relative to people of color. That's one way that I know. The other way is the fact that I'm here. Because in April of 1988, I was headed back from a college debate tournament. I was at Tulane University in New Orleans and went to a debate tournament in San Antonio, driving a rental car back. Okay? And I get stopped in Gonzales, Texas. I do not recommend this, by the way. I get stopped in Gonzales, going about 13 miles an hour over the limit. So I pull over. It's just me, my debate partner, another two-person team, and the coach. And I'm nervous. Right? And I'm nervous because I know what's in the car, other than debate evidence. I know that at that moment, in the briefcase of my coach, is the following: 1.5 ounces of weed, an 8-ball of coke, 12 sheets of acid. Yeah, Google it, and 14 hits of X. Now, not bragging, by the way, and I'm not encouraging this behavior. Yeah, I'm not. I'm just asking you a fundamental question. You know what the question's going to be, but I got to keep setting this thing up. Now, for those who are not drug users, either now or at any point, that is not for personal consumption, as you can probably imagine. That would kill anyone who tried to do all that. So that was my coach. He was a dealer on the debate circuit. He would deal to other coaches. He would deal to debaters. Right? So I get pulled over, and I know that's in there. And I'm nervous as hell because he comes to the door with that flashlight, right? Puts it in the face, and he's like, I need to see your license. I'm like, of course. I'm looking for it. I'm looking for the damn thing. It's a wallet. It's got like 4 places it could be. Can't find the damn thing. And it seemed like it took 30 minutes. It was probably 20 seconds. But it seemed like it was a half an hour. I'm sweating, right? My eyes are getting big. I'm sweating crazy, just profusely. The air's on, doesn't matter. Sweating, right? And I just know that this is not going to go well. He says, would you like to come back and sit in the cruiser where the light's better? I'm like, okay. I go back there. He's right, man. The light is way better in the police car. So I'm looking for it. Right? Finally, I turn over this one little, flap where you put pictures and credit cards and stuff. And there's my fake ID. I got that. He sees it. He goes, isn't that it? I'm like, no. That's something else. I don't know. That's like a craft project. I don't know what the hell that is. I don't know what that is. I don't know, even though it said driver's license right on the damn top. And he saw it, and he's like, are you sure? And he starts to reach for it. And just as he starts to reach for it, now keep in mind, just the license alone is a misdemeanor offense, $500 fine, up to 60 days in jail potentially. Probably wouldn't have gone to jail for it, but they're going to search the car when he gets it, right? So he's reaching for it. And just as he does, I find my real license that magically reappears in a place that I thought I had searched 5 times. And I'm like, here it is. Oh, here it is. Right? And he goes, you sure that's it? And he gave me a look that said he knew. He writes me a $75 ticket. He lets me go. Now, if you think that he wouldn't have searched that car with all the nervousness that I was exuding, the at least suspicious behavior that would suggest possibly something greater was up. If you don't think he would have searched that car if I were black or brown, you have not been paying attention. And I don't mean to this lecture. I mean to life in general in America. Okay. Hence, you'll be able to look back and say it was an excellent, fantastic adventure. Okay, that shit did not happen. The best did not leave because the winners always stay put. Only those who were suffering and losing in the system leave, and there's no shame in that. But there's no shame in it when English folk do it, and there's no shame when Mexican folk do it, and folks from Sri Lanka do it, and folks from Honduras and Guatemala do it, when folks from the continent of Africa do it. There's no shame when anybody gets up and says, I'm starting over. But see, the difference is black folks in this country know how they got here. And indigenous peoples know how they were here before, and Latinx folks, if they're in touch with the indigeneity of their heritage, also know that their people were here first. It's only European folks who apparently forgot that, as James Baldwin said, our ancestors didn't want to come either. Right? We didn't want to, we had no choice. And if we understand that, it gets harder, doesn't it, to look down on folks. Right? Because you understand what motivates them is the same, but we tell ourselves a lie. We say, well, we came for freedom, and they're just coming for stuff. The hell, we came for stuff. Land, we came for land, we came for opportunity, we came for a new start. Even if you came for quote unquote freedom, that would still be some stuff, but we didn't come for that. All you gotta do is look at the kind of system we set up in the colonies. This is a pretty unfree system. We spent most of our time in the colonies oppressing each other for not being the right kind of Christian and trying to figure out who the witch was so we could kill her. Wasn't about freedom. Right? It was about a new form of tyranny. So the reality is migration is always about the search for opportunity. People don't like to move, right? Folks from Mexico don't just cross the border and come here like for shits and giggles because they got nothing else to do, right? Nobody likes to move, man. I moved 5 years ago, 3 blocks, y'all. 3 blocks, and it damn near killed me. I was like, I'm never doing this again. I hate this. I told my wife, don't ask me to ever move. 3 blocks, and I was just done. Right? You think folks want to pick up and leave the country, the only country they know, their heritage, their language, their culture, their friends, family members, just to take advantage of some cheap-ass, inadequate health care and some low wages, and to be exploited and shot at in the desert for even making the attempt? The hell do we think people do? People do those things out of desperation. If we understand that, then the judgmentalism is a lot harder, because once again, I can see me in you, and I can see you in me. So you got to understand your own past if you're going to understand other folks' present, because they're operating on the same motivations that we were. You understand? But this is not just an academic point. I want to suggest to you that it's bigger than that, and it's something that white folks better concern ourselves with, because I think sometimes we very easily, and I understand why, but it's a problem. We very easily and readily assume that the reason we got to change stuff up in this country and fix this problem is to save people of color. Well, here's the thing. Obviously, the impact of white supremacy on people of color is the first and foremost order of business, but it's not white folks' job to save black and brown people. Black and brown folks will liberate themselves from this system, whether we're with them or not. The question that I want white folks to ask is, who's going to liberate us from this system? Because it's doing a number on our mentality. It's doing a number on our humanity. And it's even dangerous for our health. Now, that may seem odd. How can a system that gives you advantages and benefits and opportunities actually be dangerous and bad for your health? Well, think about this. Go back to that point I made a few minutes ago about the notion of meritocracy and individualism, right? If I think, because I've been told, that wherever I end up is all about me, and I actually believe that, and then I find myself struggling, how do I make sense of that? See, when black and brown folks are told, hey, wherever you end up, it's your own fault, right? People of color sort of have enough of a history to know that that's pretty much bullshit, right? People of color have been around the block long enough to know that for the most part, it's always been more complicated than that. So folks of color always at least question that a little bit, if not a lot. But white Americans have been the group that's been able to sort of buy the myth, right? I'm not saying that white folks haven't struggled, but I'm saying that historically, white folks, even working class white folks, were able to say to themselves, listen, if I just play by the rules and I work hard and I keep my head down, and if I have a strong back and I can lift stuff, I'll always have a job, right? Even those white folks in the coal mines who clearly don't have economic privilege, I mean, they're struggling. They're dying at 55 years old from black lung, occupational disease, and injury. So they're not economically privileged, but even they historically, right? Were able to look around and at least say to themselves, hey, as long as I do everything right, my kid will be better off than I was. Just like I was better off than my dad. Or they could say, well, you know, my granddaddy worked in the mine, my daddy worked in the mine, I work in the mine, and my son's gonna get a job in the mine when he graduates. But even the ability to take that for granted was sort of a privilege, wasn't it? Because folks of color have never been able to just say, oh, I'm sure there'll be jobs for me as long as I'm willing to work, right? Because people of color know that's not the way it's gone down. But if I'm a white person and you've promised me that as my birthright in this country, and then all of a sudden, I don't have a job. All of a sudden, the economy changes, right? And the assembly line shut down because the boss can make more money sending the jobs overseas, right? Or the coal mine shuts down, not because of regulations, not because of environmentalists, which is what they want us to believe, but because the guy that owns the coal mine learned that it's actually cheaper to just blow the top off a mountain with dynamite, right, and go in and get the coal that way than it is to actually use all the labor that they used to use. So it's about saving rich people money. And now these working class folks are out of work, can't find a job, 26 weeks, 52 weeks during the height of the recession. Some folks out of work 99 weeks, including millions of white folks who were told that would never happen to us, right? Now, if you tell me that's not gonna happen to me, and now it does, and you tell me that wherever I end up is all about my own effort, I got two choices, don't I? I can either start to hate myself, right? And start to think that I'm the problem, that I'm just not good enough, right? That I'm not working good enough, that maybe my work ethic isn't good enough, that maybe I'm not smart enough, that maybe I'm not committed enough, that maybe I can't support my family. But that's hard to swallow, isn't it? It's hard to take that on. So my other option is I gotta displace my anger and my anxiety and my frustration onto somebody else, right? So in other words, I'm dealing with all this self-doubt and all this pain. I got to find somebody to put the pain on. And then a politician comes along and that politician says, I can take your pain and I can tell you who's to blame for it, and it's not you. Oh yeah, when those people on that side of town are out of work, it is their fault. But when you're out of work, it's also their fault, right? So you don't have to, that whole myth of meritocracy, that doesn't apply to you. And this stuff works, man. I got an email from a young guy a couple years back, young white guy, and that was his thing. He's like, I can't find a job because blacks and Mexicans are taking all the jobs. For real, all the jobs are being taken by black folks and Mexicans. Where the hell are these jobs at? Second Life, right? Are they on Minecraft or some shit, some video game? Like, where are these jobs? Because the data tells me that black folks with a college degree are still almost twice as likely as whites with a degree to be unemployed, no matter what their major, by the way. Tells me that Latinx folks with a degree are still 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. That Asian American and Pacific Islanders with a degree are still 23% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. That our indigenous brothers and sisters with a degree are 2/3 more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. So wherever in the hell people of color are taking all these white jobs, they're not taking them far, right? Plus, it's sort of weird, isn't it, when people say, they took my job. Well, did you have the job already? Because if you didn't have it, it wasn't yours, you understand? Like, it's not like, I mean, I guess it'd be really wrong. Like, if the boss hired the white dude on Monday, and then on Wednesday he was like, yeah, just kidding. No, I'm giving it to the Latino guy over there. That might be a little unfair, right? I mean, I've had this job for 2 whole days, and then they, you know, I would understand. But that's not what's happening. Plus, the dude that wrote me this email that said this about people of color taking all the jobs, like the next paragraph, his next statement out of his mouth was that black and Latino folks are lazy. All right, which is it? Because it can't be both. If you took all the jobs, I'm pretty sure you're not lazy. And if you're lazy, I'm thinking you didn't even take one job, let alone all the damn jobs. And I have this image whenever I hear this. White folks say this all the time, this victimology. Whether they're taking the job. I get this image in my head of like this white Iowa farmer, right? Wakes up at like 4:30 in the morning to milk the cows, right? Walks out to the barn, time to milk the cows, time to milk the cows, time to milk the cow. Opens up the barn, he's like, well, I'll be damned. These cows have already been milked. Who took my job? And then Andre shoots up from behind the barn and goes, it's me, Andre from Detroit. I took that shit. What the hell do we think is happening in this country? That is not a thing. That is not a thing, right? But the thing is, if you have a politician that swears by that, and if you're in enough pain, right? You'll believe anything. You can put the blame on, you say we build a wall down here, everything will be fine. Really? You think that's how capitalism works? You just build a wall and then everybody gets a big raise because the capitalists are like, oh, they figured us out. Now we got to give everybody more money. No, capital will always cross the border. Capital will always cross the border in search of the highest rate of return. I know the president thinks that he can shut that down with some mean tweets at 4 a.m. That if he just sends out a tweet that says, you're not moving, you're staying here, that they're going to go, oh, well, I was going to make, $12 billion extra by moving the plant to Sri Lanka, but what the hell, the president says I can't, so I guess I'll stay. That's not real. Goods will always cross borders in search of the highest price, right? So if you got capital mobility and you've got goods mobility, but you don't have labor mobility, what happens? You actually rig the game against working people. Because if workers can't go where they get the highest wage, that hurts all working people, see? But we don't think about that, or we don't think about how we got in this political moment. The thing that's so important to understand about Trumpism, not Trump, Trumpism, is that it's really not a new thing. It's really not. Because the whole history of this country is the history of what we just saw happen. Keep hearing people say, we can't normalize Trump, we can't normalize Trump. Well, there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily normal and typical about Donald Trump and his rhetoric and some of the stuff he does, but there's other things that are excruciatingly normal, right? That have been typical and going on for a really long time, right? Because if you had to sum up the history of this country in one sentence with regard to race and class, you know what that sentence would be? That sentence would be that the history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. That the history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies when there were no white people yet. And you may think, that's a weird thing to say. What do you mean? Well, I mean, there were Europeans. We didn't call ourselves white. We hadn't come up with that term yet. We didn't have this pan-European identity, right? We hated each other. We spent most of history killing each other.
Teach.
The English hated the Irish and vice versa. Northern Italians didn't even think Southern Italians were Italian. The Germans hated everybody and everybody hated their ass right back. There was no white race. And then in the colonies, all of a sudden there is. What happened to justify the creation of this thing? Well, nothing really, except that the elite in the colonies could look around mid-1600s and they could count. And when they counted, what they saw was that they were way outnumbered. You take all the African enslaved folks, the European indentured servants who were just one level above slavery, and you take the other piss-poor Europeans who aren't technically indentured, but they might as well be. They're peasants, they don't have anything. And you put them all together, in most of the colonial period, they outnumbered the rich by 10 to 1, 15, 20, 30 to 1, had a handful of people that owned all the wealth, sort of like today. We got 38 people in this country right now that have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the country. 165 million people over here, 38 over here. So this thing has been going on a long time. So the rich look around, they see they're outnumbered, and they're worried, as you can imagine, right? They're thinking to themselves, holy hell, man. If they figure out that we're running a game on all of them, they're going to come and take our stuff, right? There's going to be a revolution, right? And they're going to come and take our stuff. And so we got to split these coalitions, because every now and then there would be rebellions that were cross-color, cross-racial. You would have Bacon's Rebellion as one, but there were others where you had folks of color and white folks joining together to overthrow the aristocracy, but the aristocracy can't have that, so they create this notion of whiteness, and they say to even the poorest European, you're better than even the best off black person. You're better than the indigenous. You're better, later on they would say, than those Mexicans, or better than those Chinese that we brought in to work the railroads, right? In other words, they created what W.E.B. Du Bois, the great sociologist, would later call the psychological wage of whiteness, right? The idea that, well, I may not have much, but at least I'm not black. At least I'm not brown. At least I got this right here, right? And the fact is, when you don't have anything but this will spend really well. You see, if you're rich, this is a bit redundant, isn't it? Like, if you're rich enough, this is nice, but you don't have to have it. But if you're poor and you don't have anything else, this is the coin of the realm, and you will cash that check. And so all of a sudden, these white folks who were given the right to vote, at least if they were men, right? And they were able to own land, not much, but a little. And what they do, they put the men on the slave patrol to help keep black folks in line, see? Gave them a taste of power, not real power. They still didn't run the show. They still didn't make the laws. They still didn't own the bulk of the land, but they were riding around on a horse with a gun and a badge, and it made them feel big, made them feel strong, made them feel like they had a stake in this thing called whiteness, and those rebellions stopped. And the elite won. Rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Fast forward, Civil War era, same thing. The rich white folks in my part of the world, in the American South, openly announce that the reason they want to secede from the Union and possibly go to war is to maintain white supremacy and the institution of slavery. They were very blatant about it then. We lie now and say that it wasn't about that. But back then we didn't have any shame, so we just said it, right? But the problem, see, was that if I tell you the reason we got to break away and go to war, and many of y'all might die, is because I need to protect my property in human beings, how do I get you to go fight for me when you don't own any human beings because you're poor? Because you do know the rich don't go to war, right? The rich don't go fight. They get poor people to do that, whether it's in the 1800s or right now. Rich people get doctors to write notes saying they have heel spurs so they can't go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you can Google that tonight and figure that one out for yourself, right? Rich folks never go fight. They get poor people to do it. So think about what a trick that was. If I just told you the reason we got to go to war is so I can keep my slaves, and you're a poor white person, doesn't even own any, why would you go fight for my stuff, right? You would, because I come to you and I tell you, man, if they get free, they're going to take your job. They're going to displace you. No, fool. They already displaced you. That's the point. Because if you're white and you got to charge $1 a day to work on that farm, and the guy that owns the farm can get the black person to do it for free because they own him or her, right? Guess who's getting the job? Free is going to get the job. So actually, poor white folks would have been better off saying, to hell with all this, joining with black folks to overthrow the system of enslavement that was bidding down the wages of all working people. But the psychological wage of whiteness kicked in, and divide and conquer worked. Fast forward to the 30s, labor union movement, you got white labor leaders that didn't want to integrate the union because they had swallowed it. They had bought it, right? And they were saying things like, well, we can't integrate. My God, if we bring these black folks and these Mexican folk and these Chinese folk into the union, they're going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. No, fool, they're going to double the size of your union. And that's probably really helpful when you go on strike. Right? Because when you go on strike, if you don't have them next to you on the strike line, guess who the boss is going to replace you with? The very black and brown folks that you didn't want to stand next to and work next to, right? And then you're going to blame them for taking your job, not the rich white dude who gave it away just to split y'all off of one another and divide and conquer you. And here it is again, right? 80 years later, working on immigration, same thing, telling folks the reason they don't have a job is not because of Wall Street, which I beg to remind you, was not destroyed by Mexicans, documented or not, was not destroyed by black folks, was not destroyed by peoples of color. It's just the highest SAT having white boys in the banking industry, right? These all had business degrees. Like, God, you know, they got to be smart. They had high SATs. And I know people get upset when I say that they were white. They're like, that's sort of racist. It's not racist. It's descriptive, right? And if they had been black or brown, all y'all would have noticed, everybody would have noticed. If it had been black folks or brown folks that took off with $13 billion worth of other people's money, or stole it, or lost it, or squandered it, if black and brown folks lose trillion, $13 trillion, if you lose that kind of money and you're black or brown, there's not another banking job that a black or brown person is ever going to get. Not even like a teller, not even like a drive-through window, right? Just no, you're not getting these jobs. White boys destroy Wall Street, lose trillions, and the result is what? That they keep getting bonuses. They keep getting bonuses. Nobody's going into the business schools and saying, look, white guys, I know you want to be bankers, but you've proven yourself incapable of the task, and we're giving those jobs to people of color now, or perhaps some women, but of all colors, but definitely not white boys. Right? Nobody's doing that. I'm not saying they should. I'm just saying we have a different standard, right? And that's the problem. We got people looking over here at the problem rather than over here where the problem is, because for 400 plus years, we've been told that the enemy was black and brown. That divide and conquer is not new, but it keeps working, and we have to push back against it, because if I don't push back against it and I'm a white person and I internalize all that shame when I'm struggling, my only options are either scapegoat somebody else, which means the problem doesn't get solved, right? And I'm still going to be hurting. Or the other option is I can destroy myself. And y'all know some folks are doing that because you've heard about the opioid crisis, right? They keep talking about this. These white folks in small town America that are getting hooked on Oxy, and then the Oxy, is not strong enough, so they're getting street heroin. It's interesting that we call this a crisis, and we have all this sympathy for it, because there was an opioid crisis in the 70s, mostly headquartered and located in black and brown poor communities, and we did not call it a crisis. We did not counsel rehab, education, and treatment. We counseled prison. We called people junkies, and we locked them away. And the same thing is true when the crack epidemic hits in the 1980s and 90s. We call people addicts and we lock them away and punish them, not give them rehab. So all of a sudden, white folks, salt of the earth, white people in rural America are getting hooked. We're like, oh my God, we got to help these people. About damn time we have that attitude. About that time that we believe that, right? But here's the thing that's interesting about the opioid crisis and is related to the point I'm trying to make. Right? Think about this. There was a study that came out shortly after the election. They were doing these studies to figure out what were the factors that were most highly correlated with Trump's support. And there were a lot of them, and they're hard to sort of disentangle. Sometimes they interact with each other. But one of the most highly correlated factors at the community level with Trump's support, at the county by county level, was the level of opioid addiction in that county. The more people addicted to opiates, the more white folks in particular, addicted to opiates, the higher the level for Trump. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that you had to be high to vote for Donald Trump. That's not actually my argument. Though it's a fascinating sociological query that the academics in the room might want to engage. Whatever. Good luck with that research. That's not my point. My point is that what is an opiate? Think about it. What is an opiate? Pharmacologically, just like its most basic pharmacological purpose is to do one thing: block pain, right? That's all it does. It doesn't solve the problem. If you got a crushed disc in your back, you're going to need surgery. The opiate is not going to fix your back, but it will get you through, theoretically, until you can get the actual problem solved. Same thing with cancer. They might put you on opiates, right? But that's not going to solve the cancer. You're going to have some other stuff done. So it's sort of like when Donald Trump comes along and says, I got a solution for your pain, that doesn't really speak to the problem. He's like a walking, talking, breathing human opiate. And it's killing the very people who take it, right? There's this study came out 2 years ago, found that there's been this huge increase in deaths in white communities, working class, non-college educated, middle-aged white folks, right? An excess death rate in those communities from suicide, opioid addiction, and heavy drinking that causes cirrhosis of the liver, right? Not natural causes. These are self-inflicted wounds. And it's happening in white space, not black and brown space in the same way. In the black and brown spaces, even though the death rates are higher, don't get me wrong, they're headed in the right direction. They're going down. The mortality rates are getting better. In the white community that I just described, they're getting worse. Why? Well, it's not because whites are hurting worse than people of color. Like I said, unemployment, poverty, wealth, any category you want to look at, white folks are better off than people of color, even though millions are struggling. The point is, white folks have been promised this. And if I've been promised this and I'm only getting this, I got to numb the gap between that because I don't know how to deal with that. See, people that never had any expectations learn how to struggle, right? If you never had any expectations, if you always knew that life was a hustle and you're going to have to grind to get where you got to get, then you don't give up when you run up against that wall. But if you were told that you didn't have to hustle, that all you had to do was work hard and play by the rules which people like you, after all, created, and then you hit that wall, you go crazy. You don't know how to deal with that. Well, you told me my life would be an 8 and it's only a 5.5. Oh, hell no. See? So I got to either take you out or I got to take myself out, which is to say that this privilege of expectations that the dominant group has had is really unhealthy. I mean, it's good as long as it all works out, right? But when the economy changes and it doesn't work out for a lot of people, it becomes a self-destructive thing. That notion that where you end up is all about you, uninterrogated, becomes a dagger pointed at the very heart of the people who created that myth in the first place. Back in April of 2011, there was a cover story in Newsweek, and they were interviewing these white guys who were like managers. These weren't even like working class, these were managers, right? And they lost their jobs in the recession. Some of them had been out of work for like a year, and they were freaking out, and they're walking around looking for jobs, and this one guy's interviewed, and he says, every time I'm out looking for a job, I feel like I've got a neon sign around my neck that says, unemployed lazy bum. And I remember thinking to myself, man, who told you that unemployed people were lazy bums? I know who didn't tell you: unemployed people. I'll tell you who else didn't tell you. Black folks. I'll tell you who else didn't tell you. People of color generally. You know who told you that unemployed people were lazy bums? You told you. And people like you told you that they were lazy bums. And so the very ideology that you rocked all those years thinking that it would never come back to bite you on the ass has now come back to bite you on the ass, which is to say you'd have been better off to just listen to people of color from day one. Because they could have told you the system was a scam from the time that they were 12. They could have told you that it was a setup. They could have told you that it was a ripoff. They could have told you that it was a hoax, but we didn't want to believe it. And now we're the ones who are the least prepared for change. That's why you see these videos on YouTube, right, of like this white guy in Starbucks that has this meltdown because he got like bad service from a barista who happened to be black. Check this out. Go look for it. Look for white dude Starbucks meltdown. It'll come up. This guy's going just nuts because he got his latte with soy milk or something and I don't know, and he's yelling at her and he starts using racial slurs against this black barista and throws out there, I voted for Trump. What do you think about that? Oh, why the hell is that relevant to your order? Right? He just wanted to say it just to like bust it off on her, and so he's yelling at her, using racial slurs, and then he goes on later to he feels oppressed. Look, here's the thing. If you think bad service at a coffee joint is oppression, you clearly have never experienced oppression, all right? If you think that bad service at the Starbucks is being oppressed, you've just proven white privilege. I don't even have to give my damn talks. I could just come up, show you that clip and be like, that shit right there, that's what I'm talking about, right? But this obliviousness is dangerous, right? Because that dude's having an existential crisis precisely because he's never had to come up against the idea that maybe his life wasn't going to work out quite the way he thought it was. See, James Baldwin had something to say about this too, and I'll close with it, and then I'll take some questions. Baldwin said, he was talking now, this time, first quote was about white folks. This next one's about black and brown folks, specifically African-American folks, but I think it applies to people of color generally in a system of white supremacy like ours. Baldwin said, I don't mean to sentimentalize suffering, but that person who can never suffer can never grow up, can never learn who they are. That man who has to every day snatch his humanity out of the fires of human cruelty that rage to destroy it, learns something about himself in the process that no school on earth and indeed no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable. Because in order to save his life, he is constantly having to look at the meaning behind the words, to read between the lines. And he goes on to say, when one is constantly having to survive the worst that life can bring, one eventually ceases to be afraid of the worst that life can bring. And I guess the point I'm trying to make to you is, in this era of Trumpism, when folks are sort of popping off and afraid, know this. For the most part, people of color are not afraid because they've seen this movie before. And they are not the ones who are losing their minds at the threat posed by Trumpism. It's those of us who weren't ready. People of color have been trying to tell us for hundreds of years, hold the mirror up to our face and tell us that we have been lying not only to them but to ourselves. And only now are some of us beginning to believe it. For the love of God, let us start listening to those persons of color. Let us join with them, whether it is in the streets, whether it is in the classroom, or whether it is at the ballot box. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll take some questions, and then I do have copies of my latest book, which actually, just so you know, in the intro, the one I'm working on, which was supposed to have been out by now, but is not, was mentioned. That was the White Lives Matter book, which is a look at the issue of race crime and police misconduct. That is not out yet, but the one I do have is Under the Affluence, which is the one that looks at the connection between economic and racial inequality, class and race, that came out 15 months ago or 16 months ago. So I do have that, and I'll be happy to sell folks that after we're done. But if you have questions, raise your hand. I don't know if we've got mics. We do have a mic there, and we have a mic here on the side. So if you're physically able to get to the mic, fantastic. If you're not physically able to get to the mic, or just don't, some people don't like to get up at the mic and ask questions, I understand. so I can just call on you as well. I'll start here since I see your hand, and then I'm going to move right over there to the mic. Go ahead. Yeah, whoever had their hand. Oh, yeah, go ahead if you can. Great.
Thank you for that. I don't know if the mic's working. Can you hear me?
I don't know if it is. I don't know. Just talk loudly, I guess.
Do you have any advice as to how to handle Trump supporters based on the notion that Hillary Clinton handled Trump supporters wrong, didn't say she understood them, didn't act like she understood them? Any advice for us?
Well, I think so. Here's the thing. I think the big mistake that Hillary Clinton made vis-a-vis supporters of Trump, I think, was that when she decided, and I don't know whether it was calculated or not, but when she decided to make the issue them, that they were the ones who were deplorable rather than Donald Trump for the rhetoric that he was using, that was politically a horrible decision. It was also unfair because politically it was a horrible decision. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of truly deplorable people in that coalition. The white nationalist movement people, the so-called alt-right, which I much preferred when they just went by their much more honest name, Nazis. But those folks are certainly deplorable, but that's not the typical Trump supporter. Now, I don't want to cut too much slack here, but what I do want to say is that I think the smarter approach would have been for her and now for us to say, rather than his people are a bunch of bigots, and some certainly are, and the data certainly says that that had a lot to do with certain people's support and that it may have tipped the balance. But what she should have said was, you know, Donald Trump thinks that you're so racist that you're going to fall for him blaming people who didn't cause these problems. It's almost like a way of saying to the person who actually might be racist, you know, it's almost like appealing to their better nature and saying, surely you're not going to fall for that. He's trying to manipulate you. He's trying to get you to think that the reason you don't have a job is because of Mexicans. But that's not true, and you know better than that, because there's actually some research which says that when people who actually do have bias, and we all have some, we've all been programmed to have it in this culture, one of the best ways to get people not to act on bias is to challenge them to rise to the better angels of their nature and treat them like people who are capable of doing right even when their inclination might be to do wrong. There's all this research on undoing subconscious bias which says that if we appeal to that part of people, now the hardcore bigot, it's not going to make any difference, but nothing's going to make a difference with them. Those people that make up maybe that 10 or 15% that are movable, I think are movable in that way. The second point I would just make is, look, that I have no problem expressing empathy for struggling white folks, but I do suggest that we must demand reciprocity from them. And what I mean by that is, you know, if white folks who were struggling in Appalachia, in coal country, in the automobile industry, and in the Rust Belt states, if they want us to be sympathetic to their pain, and I get it, and we should be, because some of that pain is quite real, but they must extend the same to black and brown folks who have been in pain a long damn time. And they must acknowledge their similarity with those black and brown folks. It cannot be a one-way street. And so I think if we say, listen, we'll meet you there, and we'll listen to what you have to say, but you got to listen to what these folks have been saying for a very long time, because we have to build that kind of coalition, and we're not going to do that by ignoring people of color who have always been right about this thing and suddenly pandering to white folks who just learned yesterday that the system is a setup. Right? That's not the way to do it. So that's what I would suggest, at least at first. Thank you. Yes, over here.
Okay, I'm going to try and make this fast. So I'm out to lunch the other day with my mom, a couple friends, in particular my white friend, blonde, green eyes, the whole bit, her daughter, 6 years old. And her daughter looks at me. Her name's Kara. She's the most precious thing ever. But she looks at me and she says, Asia, I was watching TV and I saw there's a group, Black Engineers of America, something like this. Yeah. And she said, but I know that's racist. And I said, really? Why is that racist, Kara? And her mom, she looks at her mom because clearly it's gone too far. She doesn't know what to say. So mom looks over and she says, she sees that I'm about to go, you know, let Kara know. But she says, oh, Asia, just think about it from Kara's perspective. So I had to think, okay, I know what her mom is going to say, but I had to make a decision. Do I go into this lecture now in this pizza joint with everybody watching, or do I save it for later when mom's not around so that I can really get into it with Kara?
Right.
But I want to know, what do you think I should say to her? And if I like what you say, then I'll share it, and she'll be lucky enough to get a response from Tim Wise.
Well, so here's the thing. the question, or even the comment by this little girl, who's 6 years old and does not know the context for the creation of the National Society of Black Engineers, which is probably the group you're talking about, it makes perfect sense that she wouldn't get that. It doesn't shock me at all. It's totally understandable. It's developmentally appropriate. I'd be stunned if she didn't think that that was racist, given a 6-year-old's understanding of history, context, and what racism is. So this happened with one of my own kids. You know, one day she asked the question about, at her school they have like they have their graduation ceremony, you know, for the high school, for the seniors when they graduate, and this is when this youngest daughter of mine was probably in 5th grade, 4th grade, and so the seniors, when they graduate, they have like black seniors have like a black graduation ceremony for their family and for their friends, like a special thing. And she was like, "Daddy, is that?" She wasn't sure. She's like, "Is that racist to have that, or why do they need that? Why do they have that?" And I said, "It makes perfect sense you're asking that question." I said, "Here's the thing. Historically, people of color were excluded from the same educational opportunities, both in general and at this school in particular. And so as a result, many years ago, black parents decided we ought to do something special to signify the importance to our family, to our community, of succeeding in school, of graduating, of going on to college, not as a way to say that we're better than anyone else or that we're superior, but just as a way to say, hey, we had to overcome some stuff to get here that was special, that was specific to us. And it would be fine for any group who is facing those obstacles to do the same thing, and historically they have. So historically there have been Irish American groups that formed, Jewish American groups, Italian American groups that have formed to celebrate their overcoming obstacles. Now, as the Irish, as the Italian, and as Jewish folks assimilated into whiteness, that became less necessary. But when they were still facing those systemic obstacles, it was very common and no one questioned it. So really, I said to her, I said, you know, there are also organizations that exist specifically that focus on women and girls like yourself, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, because women and girls face obstacles that are specific to their sex and gender that men do not. And as a result, it's important for them to be able to celebrate, for instance, women engineers and women who are in STEM fields who are often heavily outnumbered. And so when women succeed in those fields, we ought to not only celebrate that, we ought to make a special effort to include, because we know they've been excluded. And once you give that context, then of course she was like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. You know, and so I think that it's just about saying, oh, well, of course, you know, it makes sense that you would ask that. Because, you know, if you don't know what came before, you're not going to know why you see what. And so that's a real simple sort of way to put it, or, you know, you can figure out your own way, obviously, to say it. But in general, I think it's just about saying, oh, great question. Here's the answer and the context that you need to understand it. And my guess is she will.
Papa Wise coming through with the suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You bet. Over here. Yes.
Hi, my name's Amber. I'm the managing editor of the Courier.
Thank you. You bet. Over here. Yes.
Hi, my name's Amber. I'm the managing editor of the Courier paper here on campus. If you've gotten this question before, please humor me. How do you, or how would you respond to any criticism that because you are a white male talking about racism, that you're either speaking for black and brown people, or that you're profiting or making a living off of racism?
Right. Well, it's a perfectly legitimate question. I get it a lot, but it's a perfectly understandable one. And it's one that any white person doing the work should get and should be ready to answer and prepared to think about. I'm certainly not trying to speak for people of color, that's for sure. Because people of color, whether it's Baldwin, who I quoted, whether it's Du Bois, who I mentioned, or whether it's anyone else, have spoken for themselves well enough, and they don't need me to do it. I don't claim to know the black or brown experience. That's why I told stories about my own. So I'm not even trying to speak for all white people, but I am speaking to the white experience, right? I'm speaking to white privilege. I'm speaking to my own family experiences and these stories that sort of contextualize my own racialized life, right? So I'm telling a story that I am uniquely positioned to tell. As a white person in the belly of that beast. So I'm not trying to tell a black or brown truth. I may be sharing truths that black and brown people certainly recognize and that they tell a lot, but the truth that I'm fundamentally trying to speak to is the pathology of whiteness to white people. and the damage that it does, in fact, to us, which would be very strange for black and brown folks to focus on, because black and brown folks have got to focus on the impact to them. It would be very weird, I think, for a person of color to talk about, like, oh, the white folks who were killing themselves because of white supremacy. But that is my job, to try to figure out ways to build coalition. As far as the piece about profiting, I think, look, here's the thing. Anybody who does any job that deals with civil rights, it could be a white person who does civil rights law. There are lots of civil rights attorneys historically. Probably most of them have been people of color, but there have also been some pretty prominent white ones. And I guess one could make the argument that if you do civil rights law and you're white, that you're profiting from racism, or if you teach in a high school about racism in a history class and you're white, that you're profiting from it, or, there's all kinds of arguments that you could make. But at the end of the day, the question is not do I have privilege and not do I receive it in the giving of this speech, but do I utilize that privilege in a way that is as responsible and as accountable as possible? Now, that's an open question, and we can all answer it differently. My feeling is accountability requires a couple of things of me. As I do this work professionally. Number one, if I don't do it professionally, that means, and if white folks generally shouldn't because we make money from it, that means it becomes a hobby. I get very nervous about the idea of white people making this like, well, I could do pottery or I'm going to fight racism. Like I could go to the yoga studio, or I could build model airplanes, or I could fight white supremacy. Like, it seems to me I don't want a hobbyist. I don't think white folks need to dabble in this at the end of their work week when everything else is done. I think it's something we ought to commit to, and if that means that we make a living from it, okay. But to be accountable, I think we got to do a couple things. Number one, we have to try to steer people in our audiences or our readership or on our social media sites nowadays to the work of people of color. And I do that regularly, not only by people that I quote in my speeches, but in my books. The scholars who I reference are disproportionately people of color. The folks whose wisdom I share on social media, disproportionately people of color. The people on the reading list on my website, timwise.org, in the recommended reading section, overwhelmingly people of color. I'll give you a couple of, one particular book I recommend everyone read, and this is from a scholar of color at Emory University, Carol Anderson. Her recent book, White Rage, brilliant analysis of how right now what we're seeing, and she wrote it actually before the election, but she was very prescient in terms of what she foresaw, is that every era of progress for peoples of color, particularly black folks, has been met with this rage-filled pushback on the part of whites trying to reassert the past system, as in make America great again, right? I mean, it's like the perfect example. So by all means, I want you to buy my books because, they're here and I sell them. But buy Carol Anderson's book, read Baldwin, read Angela Davis, read Bell Hooks, read Claude Steele. There's a number of people, again, on my reading list who I reference because I want folks to look at that wisdom. And the third piece of accountability is financial give back. 25% of my fee goes back to the nonprofit organization with which I work that schedules those speeches, but they're not a traditional speakers bureau. They are an organization that does leadership development on campuses and in communities. 70% of the people in the organization and speakers in the organization and educators are folks of color. We do curriculum development, we do films, we do written materials that are intended to be anti-bias training or anti-oppression training materials. And we're able to do that because every one of us in that quote-unquote bureau, but really nonprofit group, gives back 25% of our fee. We could all keep that money, and we could pocket it and just do what we do, the folks of color and the white folks, but we don't because we support the mission of that organization. And so I think that both the financial give back, the professional, sharing of wisdom, and the recognition of pointing out people that I want people to listen to, when there are folks of color who come to your campus, it's really important that you show up in these or better numbers for them. That's another really important thing for people to do that I think sometimes we forget. And so I don't know that it ever makes for perfect accountability. I don't think there is such a thing. And every white person who does this work is going to screw up. Every man who tries to speak against sexism is going to screw up. When straight folks and cisgendered folks speak against straight supremacy and transphobia, we're going to make mistakes. But I think at the end of the day, those of us who have privilege, and we all have it in some area, every one of us has got some of it somewhere. If you're somebody who cares about poor folks and poverty, but you yourself are not poor, you shouldn't say to yourself, well, I'm not going to take up that fight. because after all, I'm not poor, that doesn't make sense. We need folks to get involved in all of these struggles, race, class, gender, sexuality, as allies. Now that does mean following, not trying to lead. And so I try to make sure that I'm following the lead of those folks of color whose work I reference, those communities of color, those organizations of color, like the People's Institute in New Orleans, which trained me, and others as well. Sometimes I do it well, sometimes I don't. But I think that's the task of all of us who are white, and try to do the work with integrity.
Thank you so
You
much.
bet. You bet. Over here.
Hi, Tim. First, I'd like to start off with just saying thanks for coming to PCC. And my question is in regard to what has been going around lately is Asian privilege. In respect to white privilege, as some people may or may not know, Asians are at the moment kind of out earning whites. They're better educated than whites, and socially, most likely they suffer or they have the same advantages that white people have, in that you're probably not going to look at an Asian person and think that they're a threat to society. They're probably not going to be profiled like blacks and other Hispanic.
It definitely
but for the most part, Asians have been dubbed the model minority group.
Right.
And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. I was just wondering if Asians, they suffer from the same similar oppressions that blacks and other Hispanics did, as you mentioned in your talks, internment camps, and the railroads, everything.
Right.
They suffer from oppression, racism, much like blacks and Hispanics. And I was just wondering if Asians, are doing well for the most part in America. How come blacks and Hispanics in particular, and probably other minority groups, haven't quite caught up to Asians?
Okay, so this is really not too complicated, but it too requires a bit of a history piece. The notion of the model minority, first of all, you got to understand where this came from, right? Because when you understand the origin of it, you understand how cynical the argument is that you just shared. Not saying it's your argument, but it's one that gets made, and it's one that you've just brought up. The origin of that term literally traces back to 1961 and 1962, when three magazines in particular, U.S. News and World Report, Life magazine, and I think it was Look magazine, which was another magazine at that time that was very popular, all did these stories about either Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, or Japanese Americans. And they use this term, model minority, to suggest that, why can't black folks be more like this, right? Now, here's why it's a cynical argument. In 1961-62, the immigration restrictions that affected Asians hadn't even been lifted yet. But here you had these magazines saying, look how model they are, look how great they are. Why would they have done that in 61 and 62? Well, because that's the moment when the civil rights movement, being led by black folks, is in the street demanding an end to oppression. So you got these media folks who are basically saying, stop your whining and just work hard. So I think it's a very cynical argument, because at that moment, we were still blocking Asians from coming into the country, and we were about to start bombing the hell out of Southeast Asia. We're about to kill about 3.5 million Vietnamese, Thai, Lao, Cambodian, and Hmong folks in the name of a war that we knew damn good and well didn't make sense. So I don't buy it when people say that, oh, look at these model minorities, because we killed a lot of them, even as we were saying that. Second point, the idea of Asians as this aggregate group that are doing well is statistically, historically, conceptually wrong. Certain Asian subgroups are indeed out-earning whites on a family and household basis. Others are most definitely not. Let's look at the ones that are. By and large, it's Korean Americans, Japanese Americans in particular, sometimes Chinese Americans, sometimes Filipinos, depending on the area. But here's the problem with that data. Oh, and subcontinental South Asian Indians, right? But here's the problem with that argument. A couple points. Number one, on average, since that's the phraseology you used as well, on average, they're better off than. On average, Asian households have 1 to 2 more people in them and 1 to 2 more earners in them. So in other words, if you got white households here with maybe 1 earner or maybe 2, and you might have an Asian household over here with 2 or 3 people in the family working, or maybe 4 people in the family working, the fact that this group is making more than that group is just a math game. But per capita, they're not making more. Per capita, they're making less. So in fact, they're not really better off, and they're earning relative to how many people are putting in effort, they're actually not doing very well. That's the first problem. The second problem is that 60% of all Asian and Pacific Islanders in this country live in 5 states. and I think we know what they are. They are Hawaii, they are California, they are New York, they are, I believe, Washington State and Illinois, perhaps, or maybe DC, which is not a state, obviously, but 5 areas, right? And the important thing about particularly California and Hawaii, as the 2 biggest that represent alone about half of Asian Americans, 45 to 50% of Asian American and Pacific Islanders, is that those are states that compared to the rest of the country have higher average incomes. So if Asians are clustered in places with higher average incomes, then Asian households are going to have more money than white households and Latino households and black households that are spread around the country. In other words, it's like saying, yes, you're right, Japanese Americans in San Francisco make a lot more than white folks in Des Moines, Iowa. No shit, right? Of course they do. It's also more expensive to live in San Francisco than it is in Des Moines, Iowa. So when you disaggregate all of that data and you break it down at the local level, here's what you find. In Los Angeles County, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, even just the aggregate, let alone if we tease out the different groups, Asian American and Pacific Islander poverty in Los Angeles County is nearly double the rate of white poverty in Los Angeles County. The only reason it doesn't look that way nationwide is because it's aggregate data. When you actually look at the people in the same area, when you look at whites here, Asians here, they're not doing equally well. Chinese American professionals with college degrees earn currently 55% of what white professionals with college degrees earn. So A, they're not all doing that well. B, they're not in fact starting with the same opportunities. C, they're apparently still facing significant obstacles. And D, the whole history of this concept is rooted in an attempt, going back to the point of my lecture, of divide and conquer. Getting black folks to be mad at Asian folks to be mad at Latino folks, everybody to be mad at indigenous folk, and nobody is paying attention to the bigger issue, which is rich white folks who are screwing pretty much all of those groups.
I want to thank Tim Weiss for that lecture. I hope y'all got something out of it. It is a long video, I know, but I think it's very important and it's very relevant for the time that we living in. And hopefully, you can sit down for a minute and observe what Tim is talking about. For those of you who know, y'all know, and those of y'all who don't, you're being introduced. I want to thank Tim Weiss. In fact, I want to thank Eugene from Kenya, and via Tim Weiss. And I consider him a brother from a different mother, and I hope he continues to be able to do the work, because Donald Trump is on a rampage, and people like Tim Weiss, brothers like Tim Weiss, are really not necessary in Trump's world. But I still contend that white folks need to continue with their own. The Robin DiAngelos, the Tim Weiss, and the Jacqueline Batalores, and the Jane Elliots. I appreciate them. The Viola Usos. Listen, the list goes on and on. The Father Grappis. I can't begin or end to tell you about the John Browns, or people who've always made a sacrifice for themselves for humanity. Wasn't necessarily, it was for humanity. Okay? And they could see past our color. They could see humanity was just being irresponsible into how they were treating a certain group of people, namely black folk, okay, indigenous folk, and they weren't afraid to speak out. Whatever the consequences that we suffered, they suffered them as well. So I want to thank Tim Weiss for being on that list. I thank y'all for listening. I give you something to sit back and relax to. Thank y'all. Okay, if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe and share my channel. I would really appreciate it. And I thank y'all, those of y'all who have participated, those who have sent me emails, those who have left comments. All of y'all are so appreciated. Okay? So, with that being said, I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.